Hey, Matt, welcome to the show.
Excited to be here, Tom.
Absolutely, man. It's a pleasure to have you. So, if you haven't met Matt yet, Matt Bodnar is the author of Location Based Marketing for Restaurants: Simple, Low Cost, Easy to Use Tactics to Get Customers in the Door. He was named a Rising Restaurateur Star by the National Restaurant Association and a Strategy Pro by Restaurant Hospitality Magazine. He's a partner at an early stage investment firm called Fresh Hospitality. Matt also worked at Goldman Sachs for several years in investments. So, Matt, it's a pleasure to have you.
Well, I'm very excited to be here.
Absolutely, man. So tell us about your background, how you got started in investing.
Yeah, so like you kind of said in the bio, I worked at Goldman Sachs for a couple of years out of undergrad, and then after I had been there for a few years, and kind of when I was working there, my it's actually kind of a family business. So my brother and my dad and another business partner were starting up this company called Fresh Hospitality, which is basically an investment vehicle that invests across kind of the restaurant and the food service value spectrum. So everything from farms to restaurants to real estate to operating companies that kind of work in that world. And when I was at Goldman, they had kind of just begun this company. And whenever I would come home for Christmas or Thanksgiving or whatever it might be, they were always doing all this fun stuff. They had hard hats on and they're building things and they're investing in businesses. And they wanted me to kind of come back and get involved in sort of the financial side of the business. And eventually they convinced me to move from New York to Nashville and get involved. And that was about 5 years ago. And so since then, I've been at the company, and basically my focus is on kind of deal making, structuring transactions, business partnerships, joint ventures, and that kind of thing. And so whenever we put together a new deal, typically it's my responsibility to kind of source it, negotiate it, put the deal framework in place, and then kind of make that transaction happen.
Mm-hmm. Very cool. So I've been watching this TV show called The Profit recently. I don't know, have you seen that?
Yeah, great show. Love Marcus
Yeah.
Lemonis.
Yeah, absolutely. Love that show as well. So is that kind of similar to what you do, where you kind of go into a business and make a deal and help turn it around, or is it different?
Yeah, I mean it's similar. We're typically more sort of growth investors, so Shark Tank might be a better kind of like TV allegory. But typically we invest in primarily within the restaurant vertical specifically, just to give you some context. We invest in the fast casual segment. So pretty small,
Chipotle, that kind of thing.
Exactly. Yeah. And we try to invest a little bit on almost the higher, like nicer end of the spectrum than a typical fast casual. But yeah, something like Chipotle, Panera, et cetera, that's sort of the vertical we're in. And what we do is we invest in early stage companies, typically 1 to 5 units. So very early stage restaurant businesses. And we have kind of a deep sort of focus on systems, processes, technology, and some of the other companies we have, whether it's marketing, real estate, whatever it might be. And we basically plug their business into all of our different systems and processes and kind of enable them to scale up and grow the business. And so our strategy is basically invest early stage, leverage all of our other infrastructure to be able to create value for that business and eventually sort of turn it into a scalable and growable brand. And so we started out, I've been with the company about 5 years. They started 7 or 8 years ago. And we've grown the portfolio from about, trying to think at the start, probably a handful, maybe 10 restaurants, to today we have more than 150 locations across 15 different brands. We do about $250 million in annual revenue across the various portfolio companies within the restaurant vertical. And we continue to grow and invest in exciting new businesses.
Mm-hmm. Awesome, man. That's great. So why did you pick this kind of fast casual niche?
So coming out of the financial crisis, we noticed that fast casual restaurants were much more resilient and they were much less negatively impacted by sort of the downturn. And guests, we sort of target typically for lunch, for example, a $10 ticket average. So guests were much more likely to kind of stay and continue to have lunch there. Whereas, and you've seen even after the financial crisis with millennial consumers, a lot of the sort of traditional casual dining brands, TGI Fridays, Chili's, et cetera, have gotten really squeezed out. And the people who are kind of operating at one of two barbells, either in sort of the very healthy or the very indulgent side, have won. But we kind of saw the writing on the wall early on that fast casual really had a lot of traction and decided that that was the market segment to really specialize in.
Mm-hmm. Very cool. So when you say indulgent, does that mean like Taco Bell, like Cinnabon? Like what is that?
Yeah, similar. So for example, two concepts that we have to kind of give you some context. We have one that's called Biscuit Love. And that was a food truck that we invested in, took them to brick and mortar, and their restaurant was named, it was one of the best new restaurants in America by Bon Appetit magazine. Bon Appetit named one of their menu items the sandwich of 2015. And it's, their whole menu is like biscuits and gravy and shrimp and grits and like very, very indulgent cuisine. Another, to give you kind of the polar opposite of that, we have a super healthy concept called I Love Juice Bar. And, most people are probably familiar with what a juice bar is at this point, but unlike sort of the Smoothie Kings or the Jamba Juices of the world, everything's, it's kale and spinach and everything's fresh, healthy, organic. And we invested in that concept 2 years ago. They had just opened their second store. Today we have 32 open, and we have another 25 in some form of development. So executed agreements, under construction, et cetera. So that kind of gives you some context of the two barbells that we see consumers leaning towards. We can go down in the restaurant vertical and talk about it all day, but I'm sure you want to talk about other things as well.
Yeah, definitely. So this is cool. So, when I was actually studying, in business school entrepreneurship program, and when I was actually researching my first book about 10 years ago, I was about business failure rates, right? And it looked to me like, I can't remember the numbers, but it was like 95% or something of restaurants fail. Like it was like higher than the average business failure rate, which is already very high.
It's one of the highest for sure.
Right. So why? Like why, in your experience, do so many restaurants just fail in business?
So restaurants fail for a variety of reasons. Most of if you think about it, and most people don't realize this, the average restaurant, for every $1 in sales, they put 5 cents to the bottom line. So for every $1 you give a restaurant, on average, again, it varies by industry and category, et cetera, they're putting 5 cents of that to the bottom line, 5 pennies. And so there's very little room for error. And it's a very complex business, right? There's not only are you operating to compare it to something like a retail clothing shop, right? Not only do you have kind of what we call the front of the house, which is where the guests are there and the dining room and the service elements of it. You have literally an on-site manufacturing operation where in real time, you're manufacturing from raw materials all the way to finished product and then delivering it to somebody. So there's a ton of moving variables, and people often get into it. Everybody has at least some experience with cooking, or a lot of people do. And so it seems very approachable, but the reality is it's a very tough business. There's a lot of moving pieces. The margins, if you're not careful, can be very low. And in many cases, people sabotage their businesses from the very beginning by setting up, kind of entering into, whether it's a lease agreement or the wrong square footage for the building or whatever it might be. They basically start off on the wrong foot, and they kind of structure their business from the very beginning in a way that it's almost impossible for them to be successful.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. So these businesses that you guys invest in, what are they doing right that makes you actually want to say, yes, I want to invest in this concept?
So, one of the big pieces we look for is that we want it to kind of be typically in fast casual. We want it to be in one of the two kind of barbells. So either something that's in the healthy segment or something that's kind of indulgent, like barbecue, grilled cheese, biscuits, whatever it might be. And really we want a couple things. We want a brand that has kind of a really strong brand identity, right? Something that people think of that restaurant and they go, I love that place. That place is amazing. We want them to have what kind of an industry term, or a term that's from an old book that's probably 15 years old, raving fans, right? We want them to have raving fans. Another piece that's really important for us is that we want the founders to be people of integrity. We want them to be somebody that has a lot of character that we get along with and that we can work well with. The reality is we could put our systems behind a lot of different restaurants and they would grow and succeed and do well. So we really try to cherry pick the ones that have a great food, really strong brand, great partners and founders. And one of our huge focuses as well is making everything from scratch. So in all of our stores, we make everything from scratch every day. Other than a popsicle concept that we have where we hand make the popsicles, we don't have any freezers in any of our restaurants. And so we are looking for a commitment to quality. We don't want something that is very sort of dulled down and doesn't have kind of a unique, food selection, or doesn't have really handcrafted menu items. We want it to be authentic. We want it to be made from scratch, and we want it to have a great brand identity.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. So really the quality product, making everything by scratch is not something that most restaurants do.
Exactly. And that, in many ways, I mentioned earlier, we have kind of a technology business that underpins and supports a lot of the investments that we make. So when we invest in somebody, we have kind of an existing infrastructure of companies that we plug them into. And, we view it, we have basically a proprietary SaaS platform that we view as one of our core competitive advantages that enables us to make everything from scratch at scale, right? And so that those systems and processes are so refined that we can, in a multi-unit concept, deliver a really refined product consistently.
Gotcha. So for those people listening who don't know what SaaS is, can you explain that?
Yeah, so SaaS just means software as a service. It's basically we built a proprietary software system that we use to measure our food costs, our inventory, and our labor and all of that kind of stuff. It's kind of like an ERP.
Right. So so what's an ERP? I don't think most people know that is either.
Actually not sure what I think it stands for, like Enterprise Resource Planner or something. Basically, it's a customized software solution that a lot of enterprise companies use.
Gotcha. So what the software allows you to do is basically see all the numbers in real time in the business, like how much is your food cost, how much inventory, like how much burger meat do you need, how many like spinach.
Exactly. We kind of liken it to counting cards in blackjack. And one of our businesses, we're in the barbecue business, and we have probably 20% of our portfolio, maybe 30% of our portfolio is in the barbecue segment. And barbecue is a notoriously challenging business, right? And especially in a lot of instances, you're basically smoking these proteins 24 hours in advance. So you don't have a lot of room for error. If you don't prepare enough food and you have a huge line out the door, you can't just throw something in the oven and have it be ready in 20 minutes. You had to have done that a full day in advance. And so we had to develop really sophisticated predictive algorithms and systems that said, okay, what's our demand going to be so that we can produce exactly enough to meet it 24 hours ahead of time. And, the flip side of that is if somebody's thinking, why don't you just make extra, right? Again, going back to the idea that restaurants have really small margins, something called food waste is basically where a lot of people lose a tremendous amount of money, which is basically overproducing and then having to throw out food because you made too much beforehand.
Absolutely. Yeah, actually, I have a friend here, and he has a little barbecue business, and it's called Uncle D's, and he's got like barbecue sauces and all this stuff. But one of the things he does is he like cooks barbecues for like events and things like that. But he doesn't like to do, ribs, right? Because he had to do them 24 hours in advance, and exactly like he couldn't always plan. So if he made like way too much and didn't sell it all, he just had to like eat ribs all week, and it was really expensive, and he never made any money out of it. So I can definitely see where something like that is just so important for businesses to have.
Definitely.
Very cool. So let's talk a little bit about your transition in your career, because I know you have a podcast show called The Science of Success. Right?
Definitely, yeah.
So what took you from working at Goldman Sachs to the family business investing to wanting to actually have a podcast and get your message out there?
So it's a funny story, and I call myself an accidental podcaster because I sort of stumbled into it or got pulled into it by the universe, or whatever you want to call it. But being in the investing business, I've been fascinated with and studied deeply Warren Buffett and his business partner, Charlie Munger. And a lot of people may not be familiar with Charlie Munger, but he's an incredible thinker. He's basically Buffett's right-hand man. And he writes and speaks a ton about psychology, about sort of the human decision-making and all of this stuff. And so in studying those guys, I kind of got down this deep rabbit hole of psychology, decision-making, how does our brain, the biological limits of the mind, all kinds of, you can go really, really deep on that stuff. And one day, actually kind of over a weekend, I had a series of conversations with the CEO of one of our businesses that we were investing in. And he was like, hey, can you just take like all of this knowledge and distill it down into like a 1-hour PowerPoint and give it to our whole executive team? And, it sounded like a good idea, kind of threw that together and shared it with them and enjoyed doing it. And then I basically put that on the shelf and didn't think about that PowerPoint for like 6 months. And one day it sort of dawned on me. I was like, hey, like maybe other people that I'm doing business with could also get value out of this. And so I started sharing it with other business partners, eventually shared it with a guy who I've done a couple kind of investments with that also happen to own a website. He owned this website called redorbit.com. And he was like, dude, let's take all this stuff and make it into a podcast. And I had at the time literally no idea, I listened to a couple different podcasts, but didn't really understand how to edit it, produce it, market it, any of that stuff. And so I was like, all right, let's try it out. I'll do the content. You guys do all of the other things, and we'll see what happens. And so we kind of put this little JV together, and basically we launched last fall. And towards basically through the end of the year, we had about 7,000 downloads, which I was, I again went in with zero expectations. I wasn't, I didn't really know what to think of it. And so I was kind of excited, like, wow, thousands of people, whatever, listening to the show. And then January, we basically hit this just massive growth curve. And through kind of basically present day, we have almost 500,000 downloads. We hit #1 new and noteworthy at one point in our category. We have listeners in over 100 countries, like all kinds of crazy stuff. And so it's taken off a lot more than I ever anticipated that it would. And actually about April of this year, my buddy ended up selling that website. And when he sold it, I basically had to carve out that I could take control of the podcast if he left Red Orbit, because I didn't want to be kind of married to a company that I no longer, had a direct relationship with. And so I kind of took it over full time starting in the spring, which was a little bit daunting, sort of figuring the pieces out. But I've been able to sort of systematize the business or the podcast, and I have an audio editor who does all that stuff. I have a virtual assistant who does a lot of that stuff, and it finally kind of pulled myself out a little bit, where really now I'm just kind of executing the content piece and have a lot of the other pieces taken care of by the systems of the business. But it's been a lot of fun, and the stories and like the listener feedback and stuff, and people from Brazil, Germany, all over the world sending me these like life stories about how the podcast has changed their life. It's been pretty wild.
That's awesome. That's really cool. That's actually, very similar reason why I started this show is because of my clients, my publishing clients, because I wanted to, get them more education and information and expose them to more new ideas that could constantly learn and grow. Because, I think one of the key things in business is relationships, long-term relationships.
Definitely.
Success. And, if everyone in the business partnership is constantly learning, constantly improving, constantly growing, you might only be able to do, a couple million sales this year or whatever, but 5 years, 10 years, 20 years from now, you'll be amazed how far you can go together if everyone is constantly learning and improving. And so, that's really cool. So I'd love to hear about, your opinion on that. Like, how do you get your investors, business partners, people that you work with who you rely on them to perform? How do you help them continue to improve and grow? Because, if they're not growing a business, they're gonna fall and fail.
Absolutely. And so, one of the ways that it started out was kind of taking that presentation, and I named it Mindset at the time, and just meeting with, people one-on-one and kind of doing these 1 hour things where I'd sit down, and, it took a lot of kind of pushing through my comfort zone and getting really uncomfortable, because like some of the stuff's a little bit out there, some of it's a little bit weird. And, I kind of had to get over the fact that it's like, what are they going to think of me? And realize that at the end of the day, it's going to create more value for them to be exposed to a lot of these ideas. And actually, I kind of tell a deeper version of that story in one of the podcast episodes called Embracing Discomfort, where we kind of walk through like this whole concept of how to basically sort of cultivate what I call a sphere of discomfort, and constantly be pushing yourself to sort of the fringe of that, to be ever expanding kind of your horizons and what you're comfortable doing, and growing and maturing, and really kind of always playing in that zone where you're a little bit uncomfortable. And as that zone expands, you get kind of a broader and broader array of things that you're capable of doing. But again, it really stemmed from overcoming kind of a fear or a limiting belief, if you want to call it that, of being afraid about how are they going to perceive me as this guy who's like, rattling on about psychology and mindset and limiting beliefs and all this stuff. But it's been great. And I've had some really, really cool dialogues with a lot of people that I never would have been able to have if I hadn't kind of pushed through that initial discomfort. And even things like recently, this was probably 2 years ago when I started having these conversations, maybe 2.5 years ago. And, since then I've taken a bunch of my employees to Tony Robbins' event, and that, that opened a lot of doors to kind of really have some cool dialogues with them and kind of engage on a much deeper level than you otherwise would. So that's definitely been something that's been really helpful, is like, once I kind of embrace the discomfort and push through that fear, it's opened up a whole world of opportunities to have a lot of really interesting discussions and conversations with employees and business partners about psychology, mindset, self-improvement, et cetera.
Gotcha. That's really cool. So have you had any partners, employees, people who, you thought, this person, they're just stuck in their ways. They don't want to learn anything new. They're not going to do it. They're not going to improve. So, and then have you like had a conversation or found a way to like actually break through and get those people to make changes that are really positive?
Definitely. And I mean, I think I've had both experiences, right? I've done a lot of different business partnerships and investments, and I've had partnerships that have imploded and I've lost tens of thousands of dollars. I've had, highly successful partnerships and joint ventures. And I've had business partners who are a nightmare to deal with. I've had business partners who are amazing to deal with. And in a lot of ways, I think you can provide people with the tools and the resources to change. But if somebody is really stubborn and really stuck in their ways, I don't think at the end of the day you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make them drink. And so it's always a challenge. But I think one of the things that has been a really valuable tool and kind of cracking that nut and getting through to people that otherwise would be really hard to get through to is the concept of the fixed mindset versus the growth mindset. And I don't know if you're familiar with that concept or any of your listeners are familiar with that. I can kind of give a cursory review of what that concept is. And I also did a whole podcast episode on the science of success, like all about fixed versus growth mindset, and really kind of dive into it. But basically the fundamental concept is the idea that, people sort of fall into one of two camps, and you can change the camp that you're in and you can rewire your brain. And this is proven by the science of neuroplasticity, that you can literally remap and change your brain, change the physical structure of your brain with your thoughts. But basically, people sort of initially fall into one of two camps, either the fixed mindset or the growth mindset. And they can test this as early as like first or second grade. They can give people a test that will sort of show which camp you're kind of leaning towards. And the fixed mindset is basically an idea or belief that your identity is fixed and unchangeable. And so every interaction you have out of that sort of core belief is all about sort of proving and demonstrating how great your fixed identity is, right? And so someone with a fixed mindset is kind of afraid of challenges. They're afraid of risky situations because if they fail or if they stumble, that's kind of a stamp on their identity that you're a failure or you're not good at X, right? And so when they test these like second graders, what they find is that the way that they test them is they give them a math test, and then they offer them the opportunity to take a more difficult test that they're probably going to get, a relatively bad grade on, like a C or like a 60 or whatever. And then, or they give them the opportunity to take another test that's relatively easy. And so the students that want to get an A on the first test and then get an A again and be like, man, I'm so smart, like I'm amazing at math, right? Those are the students that are falling into sort of the idea of the fixed mindset. The growth mindset is the idea that who you are and where you are today is just a starting point, and that with hard work, deliberate practice, whatever it might be, you can improve and grow and change. And so the fixed mindset is always focused on growing and improving instead of proving and demonstrating how great you are. And so the fixed mindset, the growth mindset student will take the more difficult test because they don't care about necessarily getting a C or whatever it might be, because they know that doing the harder test is going to make them better at math. And so people with a fixed mindset are less concerned about sort of their perception and their identity and more concerned about how do I learn, how do I grow, and how do I improve. Mm-hmm. And I could ramble on about this. And if you want to go really deep on it, I highly recommend checking that episode out. But that's just sort of a cursory introduction to it.
Yeah, it's great. Yeah, I read that book. I can't remember exactly what the book is called. Maybe you remember the title, but
it's called Mindset by Carol Dweck.
Right, Mindset by Carol Dweck. Yeah, it's such a great. It actually was one of the most profound books I've read in the past year. And actually, until you mentioned, I hadn't thought about it for like at least a couple of weeks. So I need to kind of get a refresher, go back over it.
Oh, that book changed my life in a big way. I was personally incredibly fixed mindset person, always trying to show and prove and demonstrate how great I was and prove to everybody how awesome I was, and completely shifted my focus towards just learning, improving, and growing and trying to be better and not really caring about how that's perceived. And it's dramatically changed my life and the trajectory of my life.
Mm-hmm. That's awesome. That's great. So how do you get partners who are maybe stuck in that fixed mindset to expand?
That's like I said, it's not always possible. Some people are just stubborn and hard-headed and in many ways kind of unchangeable. They have to be willing to change. And that's the concept behind the idea of neuroplasticity is that you can remap your brain with your thoughts. You can change the physical structure of your brain, but you have to be willing to do it, and you have to do the work. So I can show somebody all this stuff and I can try to persuade them, goad them, whatever it might be. But at the end of the day, if they don't want to, or they're not committed to, there's nothing I can do to get them to change. And, if you want to kind of dig into the tools or the weapons of influence, there's a book called Influence by Robert Cialdini that really goes deep on all of that stuff. And there's 6 weapons of influence that he talks about. I'm not going to get into all of them, but that is a great, toolkit to influence people and kind of shape their decisions. But at the end of the day, you can only do so much to impact other people's decision making. Honestly, I would say, and this is a lesson from Good to Great by Jim Collins as well. But basically, if you have business partners who don't agree with you, and this gets into an idea called the partnership grid, which I'll talk about in a second. But basically, you want to try to figure out how to not be in business with those partners long term if they're not the right people. And you want to shift your efforts, instead of trying to change stubborn, obstinate people that won't change. Shift your efforts to selecting and sort of filtering for people who already have kind of the proper focus, mindset, and ideas, and doing business with those people.
Absolutely. Totally agree with that. So I want to run a hypothetical question by you, Matt. So I want you to imagine, all these different portfolio companies you've invested in. You get a call from each one, right? At the same time, you get a call from every company, every person you work with, every business partner. Which one do you pick up first, and why? You don't have to talk about the specific person, but I want you to think about, and the reason I'm asking this is because I want people to understand, okay, what makes you really want to help your other business partners? Like, what makes you want, out of everyone else, what the qualities, what traits, what things do these people do that make you want to help them, above and beyond just getting paid for the job?
And I would say there's definitely 2 or 3 people that I think immediately would kind of come to the top of my list in terms of who I would help first. And I try to, this is a whole nother rabbit hole, but I try to cultivate my entire sort of life and design my business and everything else around the idea of, never being a bottleneck. And so I'm always trying to empower people, always trying to replace myself. And so I'm never sort of the limiting factor to growth. And part of that is giving people a lot of responsibility, delegating really aggressively, and kind of trusting and relying on your team and your partners and your employees. And so, I've fortunately been able to build sort of relationships with most of my business partners where they're not ever going to call me like out of the blue unless they know that it's like a critical issue and something that I can immediately deliver value or like help them on, or something that they really need me to kind of weigh in on. But I would say that the flip side of that is somebody who values my time and doesn't waste it with inane or kind of incessant requests for random irrelevant things, or things that they could have Googled or searched for, or, something that I emailed them 2 weeks ago that they forgot about. Like, somebody who wastes my time is not going to get a lot of my time. I basically, to quote Peter Drucker, starve all of my problems and feed all my opportunities. So if I have somebody that is sucking up a lot of time or trying to, I'll basically ignore them and kind of let little bad things happen so that I can focus on the best and kind of highest value, highest leverage outcomes. And so the people who I will pay more attention to or answer the call from first are my partners who are focused on, being proactive to solve the issue, who I know they're only going to come to me if it's something really important. And the people, honestly, who are fun to deal with and that I get along with the most.
Gotcha. So can you break it down to like 1 or 2 or 3 behaviors that they actually, like things that they actually do that make them kind of endear themselves to you and really make you want to work with them?
Like in a broader business context?
Yeah, totally.
I would say self-awareness is a huge one. So being really self-aware and not kind of having your ego as a shield about, situations. And so that means that not only can they accept reality as it is quickly if a situation is not ideal, but they also they can sort of take criticism really effectively because they know that it's not personal. And that, again, that kind of goes into the idea of fixed versus growth mindset, right? Somebody who's growth mindset welcomes criticism because criticism is a path to be better and be more effective. Somebody with a fixed mindset sort of argues against criticism and deflects and blames and everything else because if they accept the criticism, then it's a permanent mark against their identity that they're flawed in some way. And so, having somebody who's super self-aware, who can take criticism, who accepts situations as they are, is probably one of the most important skill sets and things that I find makes you a much more effective person, no matter what you're doing, whether you're playing poker, chess, martial arts, swimming, business, writing books, whatever it is. That is one of the most important and valuable skill sets. And the reality is that skill set almost trumps every other skill set, because if you can be really self-aware and honest with yourself about where you are and what you're capable of doing, and you can take negative feedback and criticism about how to improve or grow, you can do anything or get anywhere or be anything. If you get really defensive and you can't accept criticism or feedback, then you're basically trapped wherever you are right now, and you're not going to grow and improve. So that, to me, probably is a priori, like the single most important factor. There's other less sort of relevant factors, but people who have really high emotional intelligence probably is another one that I think is super important, and are able to kind of assess the nuances of situation. And I know they're not going to like barge in and blow up a deal or a negotiation that requires a lot of subtlety and tact. And that kind of gets back into the whole like Charlie Munger and Robert Cialdini and influence stuff, is like, in a lot of business negotiations, it's not necessarily about like being right or proving you're smart or whatever. It's about like, people are emotional, right? And your brain is biologically limited by evolution to have certain sort of gut reactions, certain subconscious emotional reactions to situations. And so being able to communicate really effectively and handle people that are maybe not thinking clearly or understand the emotional nuances of a situation is highly important in a lot of different business contexts.
Definitely. I totally agree with that. Yeah, I think emotional intelligence is so huge. But also, I mean, the first point you made, I totally agree with that. That self-awareness and the ability to take criticism is probably the most important business skill, because
it's the most important life skill.
Absolutely. Yeah, every area of life, for sure, man. Personal relationships, I mean, everyone knows that if you're in a serious long-term relationship with someone, you're going to have arguments. And so if you can't change your point of view about the argument, you're just going to keep having the same argument over and over, right? But I think we've all had that experience sometime where we wanted to share, like we had this great idea, this great thing, this great solution for someone. We wanted to share that with them, and you tell them, and they, it just goes right over their head. They're not paying attention. They're not listening to you. They're not willing to take that criticism and actually grow and improve. And it's like, it kind of like breaks your heart. It's like, I just gave you the exact answer, and they're just not willing to take that. And it makes you not really want to share more with that person. It makes you not want to spend time with that person. Like you said, it's like they're wasting your time, taking your advice and not actually doing anything with it.
And there's a quote from, I think it's from Mindset, actually, the book by Carol Dweck, which is basically, I'm going to paraphrase it a little bit, but it's like, if you don't acknowledge that you made a mistake, whether it's by blame or excuse or whatever it is, by definition, it's impossible for you to learn and improve from that, right? If you don't agree that you made an error, there's no way you can learn from that situation. But the sooner you just accept, like, there's nothing wrong. I totally believe this, and this is, live this philosophy out in my business world. There's nothing wrong with making a mistake. I'm never going to get mad at somebody for making a mistake. But as soon as you don't take responsibility for it, then we have a major issue. I never criticize or come down or get mad at my employees or partners or whatever it might be for messing something up. But if they don't take responsibility and be like, yeah, I totally screwed up, if you do that, we can recover from it and move on. But if you say, oh, well, it's not my fault, it's so-and-so's fault for doing this thing, or, well, it's just the situation, like I couldn't control that. Like, any answer like that is rooted in ego. It's super defensive, and it's a path out the door, basically. And it's a path to where, I'll try to throw you a couple lifelines and help you. But at the end of the day, like, I don't have enough time in a day to waste on people who get really defensive and who get caught up in, sort of traditional fixed mindset thinking traps.
Mm-hmm. Totally agree, man. Well, it's been great, man. You shared some amazing information with us today. I really appreciate it. And can you tell us where people can find out more about you and the work that you're doing?
Yeah, definitely. So, my podcast, you can listen to that if you just go to scienceofsuccess.co. That's scienceofsuccess.co. And I actually created a special page just for listeners of this show. So if you go to scienceofsuccess.co/TCK, You can get links to a couple of the episodes that I mentioned here, and I'll also link to some of the other stuff that we talked about, so that, that's kind of an easy starting place. But yeah, if you just go to that website, scienceofsuccess.co, or if you just look up Science of Success on iTunes, that's the easiest way to get in touch with me. My email, if you want to email me, you have any questions, is Matt, that's MATT, at scienceofsuccess.co. And I answer every email from listeners, readers, whatever it might be. And I look forward to hearing from anybody.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Matt. Really appreciate it.
Thanks a lot, Tom. It's been awesome to be on here.